The Bookshelf with Ryan Tubridy is brought to you by Eason, Ireland's favourite bookseller. Eason have a rich heritage of bookselling since 1886. In fact, it's probably where you got your first ever book, or maybe your last one, and hopefully your next one after you listen to this episode of our podcast. And stay listening for our Ryan Recommends slot, my weekly recommendation, where I'll discuss a book I've read recently that I think you'll really enjoy too. All the books we discuss on this episode of our podcast are available now in your local Eason store, or indeed order online from easons.com before 6 p.m. for same-day dispatch with free delivery when you spend over a tenner. Eason, be inspired. So welcome to The Bookshelf once again with me, Ryan Tubridy, and a guest whose life story will turn the pages over through the prism of just 3 books. And we've asked them to pluck from their very own bookshelf these 3 books. Not any old tomes, it has to be said. The books are 1, the childhood book, 2, the book that made them cry, and 3, the book that changed their life. And today we are honoured to host a trailblazer in the world of veterinary care with a Guinness World Record to his name. For pioneering a cat's amputation prosthesis, our guest has redefined possibilities in orthopedic neurosurgery. Founder of Fitzpatrick's Referrals in 2000, he gained widespread acclaim through the TV series The Bionic Vet in 2010 and the hugely successful The Supervet, which is now on its 19th season. Not just a groundbreaking surgeon, he's also accomplished author, sharing his journey and deep connections with animals in memoirs like Becoming the Supervet and Being the Supervet, How Animals Saved My Life, as well as 2 books for children and a volume reflecting on his relationship with his beloved dog entitled Kiera Me. He also happens to be a friend of mine, and it's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Noel Fitzpatrick to the Bookshelf. Good to see you, Noel.
It's my pleasure, Ryan. I love being here. I love being anywhere with you. Where you are is where light is, actually. And I do remember when we first met, when you were doing your show in Ireland, and I thought there was some kind of mistake because they booked me for the Late Late Show, and the Late Late Show had been like this, as you know, a national institution in Ireland. And my mother was like, "I must have made some kind of mistake, Noel." I mean, shit, somebody's dropped out. And I spoke to the guy who was doing the booking. I said, there must be some kind of... He said, no, you're really booked. And then I turn up and you were so wonderful.
Yeah.
And then afterwards we go outside and you say, now you're on the bus. And I felt really a sense of belonging. I don't know how you describe that because it doesn't happen that often in life. But yeah, if I could give you a compliment off the top, I would say thanks. Because in life in general, there's a lot of superficiality and a lot of facades and stuff, but I felt a sense of belonging that particular night. So thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here.
That was reciprocal from me and for total mutual respect in that regard. And I was so keen to have you as part of this podcast because I felt that you can do a million chat shows and you can do a few grabs at a radio interview and what have you. It doesn't quite let you go places that I'd like to go, in a sense that we're going to talk about 3 books really. So they're from your own shelf, and I think that makes it even more authentic. And I think you're a very authentic person. Anyone who's watched your TV programs knows that about you, and that you feel a lot of pain, and you know what empathy is, and you connect with people that way, the public. And I think that's why I'm intrigued to know about your book choices today. But I want to go back a bit too to ask you about reading as a kid and in books in the house. Were they there? Was it something you had to wait till you got to school? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, you'll excuse the fact that I've got 2 pages of paper here on my knee, but I wanted to remind myself about the important bits from the books that that meant a lot to me. And sometimes, when you're searching from a line from a book, I find it easier to write it down. But apropos your question, I always feel a bit self-conscious answering anything about my childhood because I had great parents, but a difficult time in some regards, which you and I have spoken about before. And I don't want to bring this podcast down from the get-go, but I was a very poor student in the sense that I went to a small parochial national school, which is a primary school in the Republic of Ireland. And there were very few people in the class. And unfortunately, let's just say I was not well prepared. I couldn't read very well and couldn't write very well at the age of 10, 11. And then I was put into a secondary school where boys from Limerick and Galway and Dublin and everybody was there. But I was a culture, you know, I was a bloke from the country, and they took that out on me. But to directly answer your question, there were books in our house, but not in the conventional sense. You know, there was a Bible. There was a dictionary that I remember asking my poor mother to look up the meanings of words in. I still have that dictionary. I should have brought it, actually.
Yeah.
I love that book. I still have it. But it was different times, you know, the level of tolerance for certain things were very different back then than it would never, things would never be allowed now that happened way back then. So I wasn't surrounded by, you know, Dr. Seuss and all of that stuff. I remember when I couldn't read and write very well, I went into the local town, Mount Mellick, and there was a shop in there, which I'm sure you will know well from the Republic of Ireland, that sells literally everything. So flour and sugar
and a coffin,
and a coffin,
everything,
and fertilizer are all there. I had a petrol pump outside. So my dad was filling up the Morris Minor with petrol, and not only was the sugar and the flour and the fertilizer. So I think the shop person actually organized it alphabetically. So fertilizer was next to flour. I mean, it was ridiculous. And I'm looking through the window, and there's this comic book in the window, which was Wolverine. And I remember it vividly because it probably changed everything. And that was the first hard, tangible piece of
literature. I mean, you know, comic is literature, you know.
And I became very rapidly obsessed with this visual image of this guy who had an adamantium endoskeleton, and I couldn't afford the comic book. So I was like, you know, at the window pane with my tongue against it. And there was no way I was going to ever get this, which turned me into a comic book nerd.
What were you looking at? What was it?
I was looking at Wolverine with his claws out. He had his 3 adamantium pegs sticking out. And I thought, what is that? Yeah. And if I could get one of them, I could fix the lamb in the shed that has a broken leg, and Daddy's put 2 twigs and a bit of baler twine around it. Now, if I had an adamantium endoskeleton, because that's what it said on the front, and although I couldn't read and write, I could phonetically, adamantium. Oh, what is that marvelous thing? I would like some of that in my life, please. And so I was a very visual person, still am, and I don't see any dividing line between life, art and science in life. I don't, and I never will.
We were talking before we came on the air about how I'm a lark and you're an owl, so I'm up bright and early, you love a late night. So what does that do for you in terms of, what, for example, sleep or creativity, or what's happening there?
Well, before we did this little chat, you and I were talking about how that came about, because when I was a child, I was out looking at the sheep at nighttime, and I'll come back to what does it do to sleep. Because when I was like between the age of 6 and 16, I suppose, really, 10 years, my job was to do the night shift with the sheep.
Yes.
So I lived on a farm in the middle of Ireland, a place called Ballyfin, and I needed to look at the sheep that were lambing, and we couldn't afford to have a shed to put the sheep in to lamb like you would in a modern farm. So they had their lambs out on a field, and I would go out and check that they were all there, and if they weren't, figure out why, and if there was one in difficulty lambing, then go and wake up Daddy, who was in the farmhouse, but not before I had tried. In other words, I would try and lamb the sheep myself first. Sometimes there'd be a lamb inside that was coming the wrong way. And from a very young age, I was really good at that because I had small hands and I could do it. And one night I went out, and I, as a matter of fact, a bit later, when I learned how to read and write properly, and we'll come to this when we talk about one of the books that I've chosen, I was learning how to write English, and I thought when you write, it had to be kind of different than what you spoke. So I wrote this essay, and the first line in the essay was, February frost had starched the meadows in silent rigidity. You know, imagine this coming from a 12-year-old.
Beautiful.
Well, yeah, it was Oscar Wildean, because that's how I thought things should be written. But on that particular night of the February frost, a sheep was down in a drain, an open drain, had fallen down there trying to push out 2 lambs. I scrambled down the bank, and one lamb was coming out, and I brought out that lamb, and that lamb was dead. And then I put my hand in and got the second lamb out, and it was alive. And I pulled that lamb up onto the bank and walked up the field with the sheep following me. And then I slipped on the icy grass, and the lamb flew out in front of me and died. And I lay on my back as the sheep was licking the lamb, and I felt worthless and meaningless and useless, and I wished upon the brightest star in heaven that I would be more clever and more useful, and I never wanted to feel that again. And so that really shaped, well, several things. I guess it made me want to be a veterinary surgeon because I wanted to take care of animals. But apropos your question, I've been a late night person all my life. Hilariously, there was a survey recently that people who are regularly awake from 10 p.m. till 2 a.m. live less long. If so, I should be dead long ago, because that's when I come alive. I mean, people say, do you not get tired in surgery? No, I just can't get nurses at 10 p.m. Anymore. Back in the day, I would operate till 2 a.m. I remember asking for advanced orthopedics kit when I was running out of ideas at 1 a.m. in a surgery, and the nurse just rolling her eyes. But that was the way back then. Nowadays we have working hours regulations.
Ah, yes, goddamn regulations. Let me ask you about your first book that you brought in with us today, because one of my favorite aspects of this podcast is when the guest brings what looks like a much beloved book off a shelf. The older, the better. And this is the book from your childhood. You've told us you didn't read an awful lot when you were a kid, that you couldn't read till you were pretty late when it comes to childhood. So I'm curious to know what the book is and how you chose it today.
Well, this beautiful tome is De Profundis by Oscar Wilde, a very old version thereof. And it's not a typical choice.
No, it's probably the most peculiar one. May I?
Yes.
De Profundis. Good Lord. Okay.
And the reason that I have this piece of white paper in front of me is because Oscar Wilde was such a genius that I didn't want to misquote him. What happened was that I had not had a typical upbringing surrounded by childhood books and so on, as we were talking about earlier. And then I got put into Ballyfin College, which is now a 5-star hotel. And it was a secondary school with boys from all over the country in there. And I felt like an alien straight away because I didn't know what I didn't know. So as soon as I walked into that room in September 1980, I knew that I was an alien, and they did as well. And I was a culture. I was a guy from the country, and they were from Limerick or Cork or Dublin or whatever. And so, not to put too fine a point on it, they beat the crap out of me every day, and threw me down the quarry and pulled the elastic out of my underpants and things that boys do. And I didn't know what to do because, I'm from a fairly stand-up farming background. You're supposed to take what comes. And I didn't know how to read and write very well, and I was stupid. I didn't know there were subjects like physics and chemistry and biology. I didn't know that they existed. And I ran one day up to the outside shack, which was which was called the laboratory of Brother Morris, who was one of the teachers in the school. And for whatever reason, there was a copy of De Profundis by Oscar Wilde there. I don't know why, but it was there. And it was a green covered book, just like that one. And it took me a long time to find that one, actually, because I the book from my childhood, I used to hide it under. I asked him, could I borrow it? It was borrowed on indefinite leave, and I would hide away from the boys up in a small shed in the garden of the old estate, where there was mouldy lettuce and onions and birds building nests and cobwebs and spiders, and I would hide in there, and this book hid with me under the floorboards, and I'd go up and pull up the floorboards, and I would look in this book, and I didn't know what the book was about. So I didn't know that Oscar Wilde was in prison in Reading jail and was writing a book which ostensibly is a book of vitriol against his former lover. But I didn't know anything about that, because I didn't know about love. I didn't know about sexuality. I didn't know about anything. So I just read it as a piece of literature to read. And I didn't know what he was talking about. So therefore I read it completely out of context. Mm-hmm. And everything was mellifluous and magical because of the way the language flowed. Mm. And I thought, well, if you want to learn how to write, that's what it should be like. Because that's the first book I ever read. And there are some magnificent lines in that book that really, I think is it's the fundamental cornerstone of everything that I do and everything I became. Because here was this man suffering in prison, getting a piece of paper every day, writing on it, pushing it back out to the prison warder, and eventually it came together and wasn't published for several years. I mean, that book is from 1916, I think, and he wrote it in, I have it written down here, 1895 to 1897. And that book made me realize several things. Firstly, there was no dividing line between art and science. There's a great line in there, and the reason I have this piece of paper is Oscar Wilde says in this book, art is a supreme reality and life is a mere mode of fiction. I mean, how was I not to know? Because I mean, that's what I thought. All right, okay, so art is where it's at.
Yes.
And I therefore, from that point, never saw a dividing line between art and science. I just thought like an artist and became a scientist. But I'm sure Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci didn't think like an artist or a scientist. The second thing it taught me about was love, and I didn't know anything about love. He says in there, the real fool is he who does not know himself. Most people are other people, and their thoughts are other people's opinions. They don't own their own souls. And he follows that up by saying that love is fed by the imagination, by which we become wiser than we know, better than we feel, nobler than we are, and by which alone we can understand others in their real.
And this was like an education for you. It strikes me as being like a manual. It's this little book with big ideas.
Yes, which was ostensibly written to his former lover, and there's a lot of vitriol in the book because he was put in jail for that, and he died ultimately for that. And he lost his children and his wife, and I didn't understand any of that. So I was reading it as it was. And I know we probably need to move on, but I can't leave De Profundis, which, by the way, I knew came from the Latin, out of the depths I cried to thee, O Lord, De Profundis. But I can't leave it without actually, this is a podcast about books, and I think this is possibly one of the greatest passages ever written in the English language. So with your permission, I'll read it, because this bit changed my life forever.
I'd love to hear it.
And it's 3 sentences, so excuse the time. Society, as we have constituted it, will have no place for me, has none to offer. But nature, in whose sweet rains fall on unjust and just alike, will have clefts in the rock in which I may hide, and secret valleys in whose silence I may weep undisturbed. She will hang the night with stars so that I may walk abroad in the darkness without stumbling, and send the wind over my footprints so that none may track me to my hurt. She will cleanse me in great waters, and with bitter herbs make me whole. And that one passage from a book set me up for life.
Wow. It's pretty heavy.
it's the most wonderful epiphany, transcendence, and connection with nature that allowed me to not be vested in the superficiality of the world, but rather to look at what nature has been telling us all along.
So you could have read a different book, and it could have taken you down a different road, probably a lot more unhappy in some ways and less productive the way you've gone to now. We need to focus on the next book, though. I say that reluctantly because that's intriguing. I mean, who pulls out of their shelf the book from their childhood, De Profundis by Oscar Wilde? Noel Fitzpatrick does. Am I shocked? No. Am I surprised? Gently. Am I happy? Very. It's great. It's great. The book that made you cry is also going to be a tricky one for people, because I presume you went on to read lots of books once you became equipped with the words and the interest and the knowledge and the curiosity. Tell us about the book you brought in to accommodate this aspect. Book 2 of the 3.
This is tough because I cry a lot.
You're a natural crier.
I as part of me, I don't see any reason to sublimate it. If it is, it comes out.
Good.
And the book that I chose in this context is The Choice by Edith Eger, or Eger, depending on what way you want to pronounce it.
Yes.
She was an Auschwitz survivor. And this book is her story of being a young girl, being sent to the concentration camp of Auschwitz, her mother going to the gas chamber on day 1, and she and her sister surviving the most horrific, destitute purgatory that one could possibly ever imagine. I know this podcast is turning into a somewhat somber affair, but actually there's a great level of hope in this book, and faith and exaltation in the freedom of life, because she goes on to ultimately end up living in America and becoming a qualified psychiatrist. And then she takes all of those life lessons, which she goes through in great detail and harrowing detail in the book, to allow people with anorexia and people with marital problems and people who have survived the trauma of war and lost their legs to cope with trauma. And it's the most extraordinary book because it is truth. It is raw sandpaper truth rubbing on your skin, rubbing on the neurons in your mind. And for me, Edith is along with Viktor Frankl, who wrote the book before her, and she became friends with him. And these are
another psychiatrist who was in a concentration camp.
Yes, well, they had a shared history. They were both survivors of the same atrocity.
Yes.
And both of their books changed my life. But I wrote down here the reasons I cried, because there were few, and they were so beautiful and so horrible as well. I cried for the first time in this book when they shaved off her sister's hair when she went to the concentration camp. And Magda, her sister, was clutching her hair in her hand, desperate to not let the past go. And Edith simply told her that her eyes were beautiful. And then she was dancing in hell in front of Mengele, Dr. Death, because she had been a ballerina in her former life. And this is the most extraordinary thing. She says, he is more pitiful than me. I am free. He has to live with what he's done. And she prays for his sake, that he won't take her life. And the third thing that made me cry was that there was a moment when Edith was being transferred from one concentration camp to another on foot, walking hundreds of miles, and she and her sister were starving, and she managed to escape for a moment while the guards were smoking cigarettes, and she jumped over a garden wall to get some carrots, and she brought them back, but she was discovered, and the the SS officer was going to shoot her, and he didn't. And the following day, he called out, who was it yesterday that defied authority, etc., and could come up now, and she was certain she was going to die. And when she got to his feet, he dropped her a little ball of rye bread. And she says in the book, 12 years of Hitler's Reich could not destroy that one kindness. And that made me cry, because we can look at all the badness in the world today and all of the wars and all of the grief and all of the pestilence, but really, one act of kindness can change the world. And enough of those acts of kindness can change everything.
And she continues to tell her story as obviously an older lady, but her brain is sharp as a tack as it ever was. And it's people like her and so many of the survivors from the camps in the Holocaust who should be bitter, who should be beaten down, who should be unhappy, maybe unpleasant with it, but are the opposite of all of those things. Despite everything. I mean, extraordinary. Is that what you extract from these stories and from Edith's story?
Well, again, to be true to the book, I just wrote down the things that I really find earth-shatteringly beautiful and hopeful from this book is, she says there are only two feelings, only two, love and fear. And then she moves on to say that all your ecstasy will only come from inside. In other words, it's what you feel. And her mother said to her, no one can take away from you what you put in your mind. An extraordinary thing was that she went through all these trials and tribulations, including getting out from there, marrying a guy, getting divorced from a guy, getting married to him again. An amazing life story. And it comes down to this one lesson, I think, for me. She says, living in your past is a prison of your own making. And the problem isn't what people say, it's what you believe.
Mm.
And so she has managed to turn this tragedy in all of its horrendousness. And she tells about the moments that she breaks down, and she goes into a post-traumatic stress reaction one day when a guy asks her for her fare on the bus. And because he's got a uniform on, and she just has a total meltdown. And she goes through all of these things in life that all of us feel, that all of us suffer, and that all of us are the same in, but we're very afraid to talk about. Well, partly because, we don't want to be thou dost protest too much. I mean, how hard can it be, Mm. But also she normalizes this in the sense that, we all have our tragedies and we all have our post-traumatic stress disorder. And the reason that the book made me cry probably was because, and you and I have talked about this before, and we won't go into it in detail now, but I had some abuse when I was a child, and that went on for a few years. So I found that I had a lot of darkness inside me.
Mm.
And she and Frankel say that you can either choose to be defined by the darkness or choose to be defined by the light that shines into it. I'd like to think I've chosen the latter. And I would like to think that, like them, I'm not drawing a comparison, but I just as a human being, that I wanted to heal so that I could heal others, specifically animals, but in so doing, their family members. And time again, I see that I'm healing families. So when people come in to see me with their dog or their cat, their entire life pours out in front of me. Their divorce, their child who has a problem in school, their cancer, whatever it is. I'm the ultimate hairdresser because they tell me everything straight away. In the first 5 minutes, you learn everything about their lives, but through the crisis of their dog or their cat.
And when you heal, do you get healed every time?
So it's a wonderful triumvirate. It's a magnificent experience when you see heal the animal, heal the family, and heal yourself.
Everyone's winning.
Everyone wins, or no one wins. Or even in the face of failure, when I fail, I had a text yesterday from a guy I've been supporting in the grief of the loss of his dog.
Mm-hmm.
And just me reaching out to him last week, he was crying, and he said that gave him hope and comfort. He'd been through a lot in his life, this guy. And he now has, he's not going to be around for much longer because he's got a terminal illness. But even in the passing of his dog, through Edith and all of her journey and other people like her, I think it's an immense gift if you can give someone hope in the midst of that, because we do live in a world that's torn apart by all of these things. But I think that these little nuggets of hope that you and I are talking about are just amazing. And she says at the end of the book, the only time you can exercise choice is in the present. So why do we spend so much time on the past and the future? And she repeats to herself over and over again, only I can do what I can do the way I can do it. And it's not what you expect of life, but what life expects of you. And that's the key to surviving a hopeful life. If you're constantly contributing, then you get it back a million times. I've seen it so many times in my life. And I think this is an unbelievably important book. It should be recorded in the pantheon of literature as a seminal book, I would say, on the message of hope.
And that is Dr. Edith Eger's book, The Choice, your second choice today. It's the book that made you cry, as you've eloquently outlined. And the word I'm going to take with us as we head to your third and final book, the book that changed your life, is that word light. Because you like collecting memorabilia. You are wearing a U2 denim jacket from the Sphere Tour, which you saw recently, underneath which you're wearing a Tom Petty t-shirt, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I am.
That says Tom Petty on it, with a cartoon picture of him. And you collect memorabilia not because it's worth a certain monetary value. You've told me before today, you said because of the light.
Yeah. Yeah, I've never measured art or physical things in monetary terms, although it does cost money to buy. You can't buy the Wolverine comic book unless you have 20 pence.
Right.
You know, I'm extraordinarily lucky in the sense that the lights that I have chosen in my world are transcendent of definition in science or art, because I don't believe there is a line. I don't believe that great artists like Tom Petty or U2 create in a vacuum. I believe that as Bono says, it's the moment of creation is when God walks through the room, whatever God is to you. And to me, the moment of creation in my operating theater is when God walks through the room. And I literally in that moment have power over life and death, and power over despair or hope.
How does that feel?
I used to find it heavy, and now I find it enlightening. Just like the things you say. So I keep some really selective rays of light, the stuff that I've collected over the years, in my office to shine some light into my life if I have a really bad 10 hours in surgery, if I'm really struggling. And I come back and my two feline friends, Excalibur and Ricochet, are there.
Wonderful.
Jumping all over whatever it is, and they don't care about the value of it, but and that's just light in the physical world and light in the animal world that I'm lucky enough to have in my life. But the third, I should give a mention to the name of the third book I've chosen is Surrender, by Bono, and as far as I'm aware, it's the only book he's written. I don't know, maybe he's written more, but he probably wrote this one in lockdown. I don't know, because I've never had the opportunity to talk to him about it. But this is not a hero edification. It is an acknowledgement of the irony of humility and acknowledgement of transience and love in the midst of abundance. And he knows that his audience have given him freedom. He knows that they have come close to failure many times. And yet he and his pals have pushed themselves on every occasion. I mean, you and I have both come from the Republic of Ireland. And you can only imagine what he would have felt like in the Bagot Inn when all the record executives walked out back in the late 70s. And then coming over here to Lyceum Theatre in London and signing his first record contract with Island Records in the ladies' toilet of that theatre. And what it feels like to be on that journey. And for me, it could be anybody's journey. I just happen to relate to this journey because it's the soundtrack of my teenage years. The first record that I ever had, and in fact the only record I had for 5 years in that secondary school I was telling you about, was The Unforgettable Fire. And I played it over and over on a broken needle record player every Saturday night when I was trying to do physics and biology and chemistry I couldn't understand. And there's a track on there called A Sort of Homecoming, a song you never hear U2 play. But for me, it was about the issue that home is not a place, it's a feeling. And for me, this book was about a man's journey through this whole life, recognizing his own transience. And the one thing that shone through for me was love. Specifically, love of his wife, Ali. I found that extraordinary. And the reason it changed my life is his humility in the face of her munificence, her giving to him and making him whole in all of his inadequacy. Yeah, I think there's a line in the book where it says, the devil writes graffiti on my self-confidence. I think I wrote it down. It's like, oh yeah, the devil sprays graffiti on my self-esteem.
Oh, very good. Very good.
And she rescues him from this because he wrote All I Want Is You and The Sweetest Thing and all those songs about her. But for me, that kind of love that he said he climbs up toward rather than falls into, that changed my life, because I'm like, oh, what am I looking for? You know, in my life, I'm mid-50s, I'm not married, never been married. And I've had this idea of what I feel that I'm supposed to contribute in my life.
What are you looking for?
Love. But I have found that love in so much abundance.
And yet,
when it comes to Christmas and New Year and you're on your own, this is not a sob story.
That's
I mean,
okay.
I've had plenty of, I mean, you and I know each other well that we could just be chatting down the pub. Anyway, I have had plenty of opportunities to find a life partner, but it's never been right. And as I said in my live show last year, the only thing that all my ex-girlfriends have in common is me. So there must be a weakest link somewhere. And taking responsibility for that. The one big line here I took from this book was, he says, be friends with your opponent, especially if it's yourself.
Wow.
What a great line.
Very good.
And I am looking for, like what he found, someone to walk with on the journey.
Yeah.
And someone that wants to go on the journey regardless of whether you know what that journey is or not.
Would you like to be a dad?
Yes. Yes, I would. I would answer that without reservation.
You said that very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, I would. I think, I would love to... people despair about the world, but it's all we've got. We could go to Mars, sure, but it's not this. You can transpond to wherever you want in your imagination, but it's not this. I'm so lucky to have what I have. This, you and I, when we were chatting beforehand, said about the sauce, the sauce you have inside you.
You have a secret sauce.
Well,
as a scientist, as a doctor, as a professor, as an Irishman living in the UK, but as a friend, you're a very distinct individual, and you have this special sauce. I think that's not plumos.
Plumos is the Irish word for blowing smoke.
Correct.
And
direct translation.
A direct translation, exactly. But I don't have any need for that because I've far transcended ego,
so
which is the other reason this book.
Yeah.
So I could care less about professor this, professor that. What I want is someone to love and that would accept me just, with my smelly socks on, like I come back from a run and I'm okay as who I am.
Are you as articulate with women as you are with people like me?
Welcome to Dating Today with Ryan Tubridy.
Are you Does it change when you? Is that what happens? Like, what happens?
I fall into a chasm of self-loathing.
Do you?
Oh yeah, I can't. My tongue gets wrapped around the poker of my own fire. And
Bono could have written that.
Well, that's my next song.
That's your gift to him.
You can use it, Bono.
But
I always feel deeply inadequate, and in surgery, I've managed to sublimate that with, I guess, skill and knowledge. But in real life, I'm still the 10-year-old who'd never seen a girl or never, I'm still the person who feels really awkward around the whole issue of, could you get to know me and still allow me to be me, and could I make you the best that you can be by being with me?
And does reading something like Surrender by Bono in any way offer you some sort of hope that your time could come, that you can transcend, let's use that word again, all those so-called inadequacies, but they're not that really, they're just self-doubts?
There's a line in the book where he talks about a moment when he's with Ali and she looks at him and says to him, "What did you bring that baggage with you for?" Oh yeah, we're on the journey together. I forgot for a moment there.
Yeah.
Why would I want to be weighed down with this? It's of no value to either of us. I didn't see that. That's what I want. I want someone who doesn't plow moss. Yeah. And somebody who asks the big questions and is interested in the answers. And to have a kid who could bring goodness and light and hope into the world, and to try and counter this culture of, it's all right because it looks all right. Really? Is that truth? Nothing is all right underneath the skin of my patients unless it is really all right, unless I've somehow made it so. But I would like to, all of the things I've done in my life, whether it's learning how to read and write from De Profundis, or being in school and feeling like an alien, and then wanting to go to vet school to fix animals, and then wanted to go to drama school so that I could understand what is it about the written word in these pages that can elevate the soul and transcend to another level, and what does that look like, right through to doing radio shows and then television shows, and now, when I do my live show in the Sphere,
It'll happen. It'll happen.
You gotta, the reality is that, I've said this to you before, I put up the objective in my life long before I think it's conquerable.
Yeah.
I've just done that with playing guitar. I couldn't play guitar last year, but Brian May, in a circuitous way, kind of half embarrassed, half finagled me into doing it and said, "Well, why don't you?" And I said, "Well, why don't you pick up a scalpel blade?" And he was very kind and showed me a few chords, and I wanted to be Brian May when I was 10. So now I've rediscovered that, and I get booked to do a festival, which is I don't even have a band, but that's going to happen in 5 months. And I've set that up so that I could do it. So I'd like to think that all of these books have just helped me to set impossible goals that are entirely achievable, because everything's impossible until it happens. Let's
go to the final question, which is the autobiography you haven't written yet?
Oh, yeah.
Question mark? It's the title. I mean, you've written some books already, we know. So I suppose it's the one that maybe you'd like to share a title with us that you haven't used yet, that you mightn't be allowed to use, but for the purpose of this podcast, work away.
Well, yes, I've written 3 biographies. And I am actually considering this one. It's true.
Good.
What I would hope the book will be called is Miracles, Music, and Me.
I like that. Alliteratively perfect.
And I think that if a publisher's interested in that, it'll be about the lack of a dividing line between art and science, and how music and medicine can both elevate us to a higher plane, but nobody's ever tried to make medicine sexy. Well, here you go. I bring it to you with joy and an attitude of contribution to the munificence of miracles and music. bring it on.
I feel we're ending with a Wildian flourish. How appropriate. Noel Fitzpatrick, my dear friend, good egg, good guy, and future resident at the Sphere in Las Vegas.
That's the plan. We'll see how it goes. Listen, it's an honor to be on the bus with you.
What a pleasure. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So here's this week's Ryan Recommends, brought to you by Eason, Ireland's favourite bookseller. I'm going with a really personal book here on the basis that if I was to be a guest on this show, I would say, what book made me cry? Probably this one, Kazuo Ishiguro, Never Let Me Go. It's all about our main protagonist, really, Kathy. And we see her childhood. It seems idyllic. It seems really old-fashioned, even though it's set in the near future. And there's just something not right. Something's not quite sitting. And about, I suppose, a quarter of the way into the book, boom, you get punched in the solar plexus and the story takes you somewhere you were not expecting. And it just gets very sad and very beautiful. The man writes beautiful English, gorgeous prose. Again, not too long, so it's not going to hurt you to get through it. I think it's a modern classic. I loved it. And this book and all the books we discuss on this episode of our podcast are available now in your local Eason store, or order them online from easons.com before 6 p.m. for same-day dispatch with free delivery when you spend over a tenner. Eason, be inspired.